Check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2.
Hello. Good morning. Well, actually, good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thank you all for coming to the Friedman Speaker Series. Just a couple of announcements, and then I'll introduce our speaker for today. I thought I was ready. So this week we have Will Masters, and I'll read his bio in just a moment. Next week we'll have Carolyn DeSena, who is an entrepreneur and creator of nonprofits, and we'll be talking not just about her work, but also the path that got her to her work. So it'll be an interesting opportunity to learn about how people develop the work that they ultimately do. Our speaker for today is Will Masters, and he's going to talk to us about some work that's coming out in a publication concerning the cost of the Eat Lancet diet. And I'm really grateful for Will, and I'll explain why in just a second. Will is a professor here at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, and he also has a secondary appointment in Tufts University's Department of Economics. His research uses economic models to inform and improve the food system, especially in developing countries. From 2012 to 2014, Will served as chair of the Friedman School's Department of Food and Nutrition Policy, and before coming to Tufts, he was a faculty member at I was at Auburn University, at Purdue University in their Agricultural Economics Department. He also had faculty appointments at the University of Zimbabwe, Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and Columbia University. He is the co-author of an undergraduate textbook, Economics of Agricultural Development, World Food Systems and Resource Use. And from 2006 to 2011, he edited Agricultural Economics, which is the journal of the International Association of Agricultural Economics. In 2010, he was named a fellow of the an international fellow of the African Association of Agricultural Economists. And he was awarded the Bruce Gardner Memorial Prize for Applied Economics, and that's from the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. And he's also received the Publication of Enduring Quality Award from the Agricultural Economics Association. So on a personal note, I am truly grateful for Will. We had a different speaker who, because of issues, was not able to make it. So I asked Will at the last minute, and he said, sure, I think I can do it. So always depend on the kindness of colleagues and strangers. So thank you, Will, for your ability to step in. Let's give a little applause.
So thank you, Norbert. And I am actually really excited to be able to share this work because, as Norbert mentioned, the paper for some of the results I'll share is just about to come out in Lancet Global Health on November 7th. And we hope there'll be a fair amount of attention to this. And in this seminar, we get to kind of look behind the curtain, see how the sausage is made, think about the methods, the data, because I think this links this work on affordability of different kinds of diets, healthier diets, more sustainable diets, and their cost and their affordability in different countries around the world over time in terms of seasonality and spatial variation within countries. This links to a lot of work that lots of different people at the school are doing in all kinds of programs from all kinds of angles, and this interacts with issues you'll be facing throughout your careers. So I'm really keen to hear now during this seminar in discussion at the end, but also afterwards, what you make of this work and how it could be useful to the kinds of things you want to be doing. The cover photo I chose for this title slide was taken by Anna Herforth, who's here, who's been a driving force behind this work on food environments and trying to measure, in particular, to measure green leafy vegetables and other fruits and vegetables, to find ways to take account of their contribution to a healthy and nutritious diet, and wrangle people like me, economists, and in this photograph, the price data collectors for the Ministry of Food and Agriculture in Ghana, and get a bunch of guys standing around this vendor who's lost interest and moved on to more different things, get a bunch of guys to stand around and think, how the heck can we measure this product that has varying qualities, very different nutritional profile, right? The weight is not obvious of what the bunch is that's sold for each price, and trying to capture its contribution to a healthy diet in a way that allows us to compare the cost of that to other goods and services in the economy, and particularly relative to income, to think about affordability. So that's our topic, is to measure what's happening at markets in ways that take account of nutritional information. So you can see how this links to the other kinds of work that I do. In addition to my school profile page, my individual page has all the slides of this and other talks. And then this project is called Changing Access to Nutritious Diets in Africa and South Asia, Candasa. So sites.tufts.edu/Candasa has everything about the project that we'll be talking about today. We have a big emphasis now on transparency, on disclosures of where the money comes from, who the people are, what are our commitments, where do we stand on issues, so that if I were a vegan, I would tell you I'm a vegan and I'm working on vegan diets. I'm not a vegan. But what we're doing is playing out the research agenda with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation together with UK Aid, who have a portfolio of research projects around food systems for nutrition. And this work, driven by Anna Herforth, as I mentioned, trying to get better measurement of food environments, led us to submit some proposals to the UK Aid and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for this kind of work. And the work has really been done very heavily by two PhD students who are here, Jan Bai and Kate Schneider. And we're building on a previous grant from UK Aid that was called IANDA, Indicators for Access to Nutritious Diets in Africa. And we've just expanded that agenda. That original project was led by Jenny Coates. The kind of work I'm presenting summarizes an enormous amount of other things. And I want to just mention that, first of all, our work on Eat Lancet diets comes from collaboration with an IFPRI project called ARENA for advancing research on nutrition and agriculture that's led by Derek Heady, another economist, working with a fellow economist called Kalle Hirvonen. And we've linked that to some efforts funded by USAID through this Feed the Future Policy Research Consortium that supported Robel Alemu, a PhD student who did his master's degree here in the Friedman School. We're resting on very deep national collaborations. So we have colleagues at each of the countries I'll be talking about who've been going frequently to their national statistical agencies, getting the kinds of data that you'll be seeing. That's Stevie Kayatsa from the government of Malawi, Fulton Mashili and Daniel Sarpong from universities in Tanzania and Ghana, and then Fantu Bachewe and Kalyani Raghunathan from IFPRI country offices in Ethiopia and in India. We also rest on a lot of fundamental nutrition science. So in particular, we have some cutting-edge new food composition data research that this rests on, and that was funded through the Nutrition Innovation Lab, particularly work led by Lynn Ausman and Shabani Ghosh. So that basic collaboration with Malawian food scientists has been very important to us. And also I'll share some interesting results on seasonality that come from epidemiological methods pioneered by Elena Naumova. So a lot of different things are coming together to think about affordability of nutritious and sustainable diets. And we're really aimed at, in terms of commitments and kind of where I stand, this is, as you'll see, really squarely focused on the question of affordability for the poorest. And you'll see what I mean by that. Where for the Gates Foundation and UK Aid and also US Aid, we're trying to understand, are interventions, both investments and programmatic investments and also country policies, are they bringing nutritious diets within reach of the poor? Are they bringing all the different foods that would be needed throughout the year in all parts of a country to achieve food security and health outcomes that we're looking for? Is the food system operating to bring foods within reach so that food choice can begin to play its role? And the crucial insight here, which may not be obvious to you from previous research, and here I'm just quoting a German colleague, Martin Keim, who has been leading a bunch of work on this question of markets and how markets relate to the own production of households. And what he did in this particular paper is to take nationally representative households consumption survey data from Ethiopia, about 10,000 people surveyed every month from June 2010 through June 2011. And what you see here is the quantity of total food in a monthly recall, in calories per person per day, that was purchased in the red and from own production in the green. And clearly, own production has some seasonality to it. There's also some storage, so even in the off-season, some of their food comes from their own production, just stored. But what you can see is that purchases fill in the seasonal gaps, and on average in this survey, in one of the 12 months, there was actually more purchased than from home production. So this household that you can see here is a net buyer of food in the sense that they produce a majority of their own calories, but complement that with additional food that's purchased. And that is in fact typical of a majority of farm households in Africa. They produce a large fraction, but not all, of the food they consume, and the rest is purchased from markets. And from the point of view of nutrition, what's really crucial is this picture. So on the right panel, what you see is separating out different food groups. And the first two food groups are cereals and tubers, the starchy staples. On the vertical axis, you have the fraction, which is from own consumption, from own production of the total that they consume over the course of the year. And what you notice is that for the starchy staples, cereals and tubers, they do produce about 2/3 of all that they consume. And that's most of the calories, and so that's what explains the green line being above the red line on the left panel. But for the nutrient-dense foods here, a majority are purchased. It varies by food, so a little more than half of all the leguminous grains, the beans and cowpeas, groundnuts, and so forth, are purchased. But most, maybe 2/3 of the vegetables are purchased, a majority of the fruits, most of the eggs, most of the fish and meat for sure. Remember, this is Ethiopia, so they're consuming a lot of dried fish, and they mainly large animals, so they're not slaughtering them all that often. There's not a lot of poultry meat in this context. But notice the unusual thing about milk here. In Ethiopian context, there's almost no market for liquid milk. You can't go and buy in a village, you can't go and buy a cup or a small can of milk. Instead, when your cow is lactating, your children are in luck, you can feed them milk. When your cow is not lactating, you're out of luck and won't have milk. So they're either producing themselves or not drinking. And it's just a matter of whether their family cow is lactating or not. And of course, some households might have multiple cows, but that would be relatively rare. And there's some goat milk in this as well. So this establishes the background kind of importance of markets. And our task is to ask, are food systems and markets bringing overall nutritious diets within reach of the poor? What you see is this other photo from Anna at a different market in Ghana. You know, vendors in the market are kind of literally standing between a food system that's rushing in with processed and packaged foods and the whole world of commodity non-branded foods like these onions that are more or less standardized. Sometimes it's something like the previous picture of green leafy vegetables. Something like onions are fairly standard, but the full range of foods across all food groups are clearly in competition with packaged foods, and we're trying to understand how that's playing out as over time and asking this question, are nutritious diets within reach? Thinking about food prices as a way of measuring food system performance. So our task here is to use retail prices for everything in the market for which a price is observed. These prices, as I'll tell you about in a minute, a bit more detail, they're measured they're collected to measure inflation and poverty. So they're not connected for nutrition at all. They're collected purely to measure inflation and to count the number of poor. And they're done in every country. Every country has both a mandate and technical assistance from the United Nations to do this. And typically they'll be collecting something like 50 to 100, maybe as many as 200 items, both rural and urban markets. And there are other sources of price data, but these are by far the most comprehensive. I'll tell you about that in a minute. So our contribution in this research, the novel thing that has not really been done before, is to take all these kinds of prices and think about the total cost per day of the whole diet. So lots of previous research on price indexes, but not this. And and you'll see why not this in a little bit. The challenge is to first of all think about recommended diets. So what is the cost of all the food groups that comprise a dietary recommendation? That could be a reference diet, like the Eat Lancet one I'll tell you about, or it could be national dietary guidelines that Anna Herforth has devoted a lot of effort to understanding and helping countries build national dietary guidelines based on food group requirements. And to think about affordability, we want the least cost food in every food group. So if a dietary guideline specifies a certain number of vitamin A rich fruits and vegetables, we want just the least expensive of whatever kind of vegetable is classified as a vitamin A rich one. In other words, to meet that standard. And our goal here is to compare to incomes and poverty lines. We're also going to look at the cost of nutrient adequacy, which is a very different concept. In the data you'll see here, I'll be talking about adequacy in terms of 21 essential nutrients. So for example, we look at protein as a whole, not each individual amino acid. And the nutrient requirements that we're looking at include 35 upper and lower bounds. So the lower bounds are like estimated average requirements. We also look at relationship to recommended daily allowances and so forth, but also the upper bounds for toxicity and for macronutrient upper bounds for a balanced diet to both avoid deficiencies and achieve low cardiovascular disease risk, as well as avoid toxicity from excess nutrients. And we're looking for the least cost combination of foods that would achieve that nutrient balance, both macro and micronutrients. In the initial data, you'll see it's almost all for an adult woman, but then we look at variation by age and sex and variation in many other dimensions as well. And we can compare that cost of meeting all the nutrient needs to the subsistence cost of just daily energy. So we're bringing in everything that nutrition science is able to codify in terms of a fixed dietary threshold for lifelong health, and ask how much does it cost if you use the least cost available food every month, every location for which we have price data. And our interest is in thinking about the causes and consequences of that food system performance. So if a food system is able to deliver an overall healthy diet throughout the year, that would make it easier to meet goals through whatever kind of program you want. And if the foods are unaffordable, there is no amount of nutrition knowledge or behavior change that can achieve the goal. Because if it's unaffordable, it is simply impossible. And that's our central question here is, are these foods just completely out of reach? So we're building on a long history of economics here. I first started working with the kind of data that we're doing here literally in 1989. And that's how old I am. And my first paper was about price indexes in Zimbabwe, where I was working. And so we're building on a long history of this kind of work. The oldest approach is the nutrient adequacy one. Not the food groups one, but the nutrient by nutrient one is actually the oldest. From the very start, when nutrients were first isolated and essential nutrient requirements were identified in the 1930s, George Stigler, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1983, this was one of his very first papers. He was like, oh, they were in the middle of World War II and needed rations for both livestock and people, military rations and so forth, planning foods in wartime. And he recognized that because nutritionists had developed these guidelines for essential nutrients, we could develop some math in order to compute which combination of foods would meet all the nutrient goals with the least cost. And that was first proposed by him in 1945. The exact algorithm to do the computation, the same algorithms we use today, were developed in the 1950s by Danzig and others. And the basic method is still used today. It's in week 4 of our economics for food and nutrition class. And it's used every day to decide exactly what poultry, dairy, and other animal feeds are. So if the price of one ingredient goes up, they run these calculations and alter the mix of feeds. And it's also used for a wide range of other things. The basic idea, right, is to meet all nutrient requirements. And what we're doing that's novel here is we have much better information about upper and lower bounds for macronutrients and for toxicity. than were done before. So early least cost diets were just crazy because the nutrient requirements weren't very good. We've improved the data a lot. We've also improved our food composition data a lot, so we have a better sense of what each food contributes. And we're experimenting with the assumptions about bioavailability and absorption of the nutrients that are in foods, and with life course variation. So there's a lot of rich kind of agenda still to go about interpreting nutrient requirements to get this least cost combination of foods that would meet all these nutrients requirements. But we're also looking at food group requirements, where rather than thinking about nutrient by nutrient, thinking about what are the other functional attributes that green leafy vegetables, for example, might bring, not just nutrients, but also phytochemicals and other things, and take account of other sort of local needs, culinary preferences, practices, and so forth. And this, of course, depends exactly on how you define the food groups. What do you mean by vitamin A-rich fruit or vegetable? What do you mean exactly by a certain type of food? And the kind of news hook for this particular new paper is the cost of healthy and sustainable diets as defined by this Eat Lancet Commission. And at the Friedman School, there's very active research beyond the Eat Lancet Commission recommendations about more nuanced kinds of analyses of not just the nutritional, but also the sustainability aspects of diets. Here we're just using one reference diet, which by no means is the final word. It's just in some sense the first word, in the sense that it's the first specific recommendation, food group by food group, for 15 specific categories of food that aims for both health and environmental sustainability, very much representing the positions taken in the literature by Walt Willett regarding health and by Johan Rockström regarding planetary boundaries and the environment. So the Eat Lancet Commission represents their interests, their commitments from the literature review and so forth that they present in the commission's report. And as they say in the report, they deliberately postponed any consideration of costs of the diet. And so that's what we bring immediately following their commission report, is this cost analysis. So remember, our food prices come from other sources. National statistical agencies collect retail food prices all the time. They do this to monitor inflation and to measure the size of the country's national income. Their aim is to represent all the goods and services that are consumed. So there's a government statistician in the United States. In the US, it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics that tries to guess what a typical thing would be that we would buy. So there's a typical shirt, a typical pair of shoes, a typical pair of socks, but also a typical apple, a typical grapefruit, and so forth. Each item is weighted by its share of total spending. So if we spend a lot on potato chips, there's going to be a particular bag of potato chips in the US Consumer Price Index. And those underlying data are confidential, but the price index is everywhere, right? You know these consumer price indexes, even though the underlying data are confidential. What we're doing in this report is drawing on a set of these data that are assembled by the World Bank's Secretariat for the International Comparison Program. It's known by its acronym, ICP. Well, everything's known by its acronym, but the ICP does have a meaningful, evocative name. It exists to make international comparisons so that such a thing as a global income can be defined, even though income occurs in different currencies around the world. So you have exchange rates between currencies that represent what's called purchasing power parity. And you see this book is the real size of world economies. So that's their task. And and the number of foods and beverages that they have in this for the whole world happens to be about 800 different items. Our novelty here is to track retail food systems, and that's quite different from what others do. Other price indexes focus on cost of current purchases, policy goals, and so on and so forth. What our distinctive thing of the affordability of reference diets is also quite different from other uses of least cost diets. So when others use least cost diets, and remember they are used to define exactly what is eaten by a chicken or a dairy cow, they're also used to define what is recommended by a number of programs such as OptiFood or Cost of Diet by the World Food Program or Save the Children. They will use least cost diets to recommend specific foods to programs and say exactly what should be purchased to provide in an orphanage or refugee setting and so forth. This is not that. We're not recommending this least cost diet to anyone because we're choosing the cheapest, and the cheapest is the cheapest. But we're using it to diagnose the degree to which the food system is able to bring at least the cheapest into reach relative to incomes in the poor world. So the Eat Lancet diet has a clear policy message. It embodies the evidence, the perspective on the evidence that's brought by Walt Willett, Johan Rockström, and the colleagues on the commission. So they defined their food groups in this way. The limited intake food groups, the media coverage of it and so forth is all about the need to limit intake of red meat and also to limit intake of starchy foods and then to emphasize these foods along the bottom of the row. They use this image where there's a global boundary, which is the Johan Rockström concept of a boundary around what we can afford to do. So the health boundary here shows the world as a whole far exceeding the boundary with respect to meat and starches, a little bit also with respect to eggs, and need to increase fruits and vegetables, nuts, and so forth. In the US, the focus is squarely on the excess consumption of red meat, but also these other foods. And then in Africa, the current diet is just way heavy on the starchy staples, and so the need is to sharply increase intake of the nutrient-dense food groups, and that's what we're asking, is that affordable for the poorest, not just in Africa, but around the world? So our headline answer to this question is answered using all of these food prices from around the world collected by this international comparison program. Here we've broken out the food group costs, and on the right you see the food group cost in the low-income countries. So the low-income countries are most of Africa plus some of South Asia and a few elsewhere. Lower middle, upper middle, and high-income countries. And you can see the range of cost per day of the least expensive item in local markets throughout the year on average. These data are from 2011. And the International Comparison Program is about to come out with new data for 2017, so we'll be able to redo this. But you can see that the price cost per day is between $3 and $2.50 or so. And that's useful to compare to the World Bank's $1.90 poverty line. So there's about 10% of the world's population, or 700 million people, below that, including a majority of people, about half of people, a little more than half of people in most of Africa. And in middle-income countries, the World Bank's also very interested in a $3.20 per day poverty line. So that's about half the people in lower middle-income countries. And for the world as a whole, it's about a quarter of the world's population, or about 1.8 billion people. And what you can see is that the Eat Lancet diet, even the least expensive food, would eat up the entirety of your income if you're at or below those poverty lines. So it is clearly out of reach. It is not a matter of food choice. There is no amount of behavior change or nutrition knowledge that would enable someone to be able to buy those foods because they do not have enough money at the cost. And these costs of purchase are roughly the same as the cost of doing it yourself because people are constantly growing themselves and buying and selling. And so on balance, this is the full cost, whether it's grown at home or purchased in the market. The mix of foods available does differ, and you notice the food prices, the food cost is slightly lower in low-income countries. We've done additional analysis. It's not because food prices are lower in low-income countries. In fact, it's the reverse. The prices for individual food items are actually higher in lower income countries because they don't have the supply chains, the cold chains, the transport, port, and storage that we have here. But it's just that there's a lower quality item in each food category available in a low-income country on average than in a middle-income country. So our punchline at the end of the day is, concerns a total number of people. I'll show you that in a minute. But when we break out by region, we can also here compare to just the cost of nutrient adequacy. And what you notice is that the Eat Lancet diets are quite a bit more expensive than just the nutrient adequate diet. And the reason is that there are actually vegetal sources of the nutrients that mean even less meat and animal source foods than are in the Eat Lancet diet. So these lower cost blue bars of the nutrient adequate diet are actually very, very small amounts of any animal source food, and that's sufficient to meet this adult woman's nutrient requirements. And we also compare that to what a real life diet is more similar to for the very poorest, where people will report having just 2 or 3 food groups in their diet over the past 24 hours, because it's mostly just a bare subsistence starchy staple diet. And what you can see is that's much less expensive than nutrient adequacy. And this premium for nutrients is of great interest to us. That's exactly the food system question that we're trying to dig into. When we compare the cost of the Eat Lancet diet to all income or expenditure, we can break it out by the full range of costs across the different countries relative to all available spending, which would be completely impossible, or the 1/3 of all spending, which is what was used as the US poverty line. When the US poverty line was first introduced in 1963, the idea was you'd spend about 1/3 of your income on food if you were a typical poor person. And what you can see is that the Eat Lancet diet in lower middle income is quite above that 1963 US poverty line, right? That's an interquartile range from the 25th to 75th percentile of all the countries in the world, with the mean of all the countries as the circle and the median as the vertical bar in between. And you can see that for lower middle income countries, it's above the poverty line. And for many low income countries, it's just impossible. It would not be the country would have to devote its entirety of all its resources to acquire Eat Lancet diets. And we see that especially in Africa, where it would cost more than 3/4 of all the resources in the country to get Eat Lancet diets. And the total number of people, the sort of punchline of the paper, is 1.58 billion people at least. So we have a very lower bound estimate of that number, who have total incomes that are below the cost of this. So that's how far out of reach a diet of this quality is compared to the actual diets that low-income people are actually consuming. There's clear spatial patterns of this, so you can see where in the world the costs are highest in the darkest shaded areas. And you can see where even the nutrient adequate diet that's less desirable than the Eat Lancet diet, that's over 1/3 of total expenditure. In other words, above this sort of US reference 1963 idea that you should spend 1/3 or less of your income on food. That's unaffordable in this darkest red region of Africa and South Asia. And what we're really interested in doing is trying to steer food systems to make nutrients relatively more affordable. And to use that, to think about that, we do this ratio of the cost of nutrient adequacy to the cost of bare subsistence or caloric adequacy. And you can see how that's a much more diverse patchwork, where the darkest colors are some countries in Africa, but also European countries have very expensive food, right? Australia have very expensive food. To get a full nutritious diet, we're looking at a premium that in the Indian context, because they have such heavily promoted basic rice and wheat through their public distribution system, rice and wheat are so inexpensive that it costs 5 times the cost of subsistence to get the full set of required nutrients. That's a stunning difference in terms of how much more a poor person is being asked to pay in order to achieve an overall balanced diet. We have a lot of work in these projects on variation. So this is work by looking over the life stage, how the cost per day varies between females and males as children, and then through adulthood, especially during pregnancy, and in red in lactation. And what you notice is, compared to the national poverty line of Malawi of $1.50, or that World Bank's poverty line of $1.90 that we talked about before, the expense is well above these poverty lines, especially in pregnancy and lactation. So you can imagine right away kind of why that is. The cost in terms of the mix of foods per, say, 1,000 calories, the mix of foods varies a lot also, because total nutrient requirements don't just scale up with the amount of food you want. For males in adulthood, you can get away with a lower, in a sense, quality, lower cost diet because males are larger physically, so more total basal metabolic activity. In these data, they have just moderate levels of physical activity, but just because males are bigger and have somewhat different nutrient requirements per total calorie of consumption, what you see is that the most expensive mix of foods is needed for children relative to adult men, and especially for adolescent girls and women, so that if you're trying to think about how the food system can meet diet costs, we need to take account of that heterogeneity in needs and meet the needs of the most vulnerable at the times of their lives when that's needed. The specific micronutrients that are needed, this is work from Kate Schneider's dissertation, where she's taking household dietary recall data and the food consumption data from the household and trying to match it to the individual nutrient needs of the individuals, and then relating that to costs. And what you see is this specific pattern of which nutrients are most widely deficient among the households, where the full range is captured by the interquartile range here, and the full bars of the distribution. Jan Bai, working with Elena Naumova, has been digging into variation. And here what you see is the seasonality patterns in the Malawi data. So for Malawi, we have 25 market locations and monthly data for about a decade, where the monthly pattern involves these peaks that are shown here with the harmonic regression method that Elena has brought from epidemiology to our nutrition research. And what you see is that the peaks are pretty much the same for all the grains that are harvested once a year. But for the fruits and veg, you have different peaks at different times of year because of the differences in the types of growing patterns for the mangoes and bananas compared to the onions, cabbage, tomatoes, and so forth. And the avocados are a little earlier, and oranges a little earlier in the year than the mangoes. And so when you combine that with other foods that have no seasonality, we can capture the seasonality overall diet cost, because there's substitution as people can switch from mangoes in season to other vitamin A rich foods when they're in season. But there are some locations where this kind of substitution just is not working, where the transportation integration with other markets so they can bring in foods from other places is not working, and you see seasonal peaks. Ethiopia has an amazing story to tell. We also have quite rich data from India that I won't show you, but just as the last bit of data to share, look at these charts. It's just astounding. What's useful here is just to compare. The axes are different because the cost of each food is different, but we're comparing the overall pattern over time. And I put the axes in US dollars just so you can think about it in terms of familiar values. Starchy staples in Ethiopia have an extraordinary record of green revolution success. So the Ethiopian government invested very heavily in improving cereals, in particular with new seeds, with fertilizer, with a lot of programs to get their cost down. And they have relatively open trade, so they bring in wheat, bring in other products, and that's been able to get prices down quite substantially after the world food crisis of 2008 to 2010. But for the other food groups, not so much. So for the other food groups, what you see is quite sharply rising prices, as well as the tremendous seasonality. And the punchline here is really that you need very different kinds of investments for the different food groups, because each food group has a different place in the agricultural production system, different locations that are relatively more able to produce that thing, differences in scale economies, and opportunities to do things that would get the cost down and give a larger number of Ethiopians throughout the year access to an overall healthy and nutritious diet. So the basic idea here is, I hope I've persuaded you that there's something new, something interesting about thinking about the cost of an overall diet as specified by nutritionists for health and by the Lancet Commission, or the new work on healthy and sustainable diets that's coming out of the Friedman School. And think about the food system starting, at least from my area of concern, that this is just way out of reach. This is not a matter of food choice or nutrition knowledge. This is a matter of people being so grindingly poor that they, even if they did nothing else with any of their resources, no transportation, no education, no healthcare, no clothing, no housing, no nothing, just devoted everything to food, they still couldn't afford the kinds of diets that we're talking about. Instead, they're consuming just 2 or 3 food groups with much more starchy staple than would be healthy. So either some combination of higher income and safety nets, as well as food system change that invests in the nutrient-dense markets, production, transport, storage, and distribution systems that can get those costs down. The Eat Lancet diet is quite a bit more expensive, nicer in a sense, than nutrient adequacy. This math of least cost diets is pretty tricky. I haven't said anything about the algorithm here, but it's pretty complicated stuff. Takes us quite a while to do, to figure out how to do it well. But it's quite a powerful tool, actually, and sheds a lot of light, I think. We are very hopeful for the future of this work with the International Comparison Program at the World Bank, but also with national governments. And the sort of poster child, the photograph, if you will, for this is work that Anna Herforth, in the middle of this photograph, has led with the University of Ghana. So particularly the gentleman behind her is Daniel Sarpong, now the Dean of Agriculture, with whom I've had a long-standing collaboration. He's an economist there, and he's been, together with Anna and others, negotiating this dialogue with the Ghana Statistical Service and the Ministry of Agriculture, building on the first photograph you saw of Anna getting those people to sort of get these prices right for these green leafy fruits and green leafy vegetables. And we hope that they can actually launch these new price indexes in 2020. So thanks very much for all this funding from Gates and UKAID and USAID to you for this. Looking forward to talking about it.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. We are really thankful for that. What we're going to do is open up the audience for questions, and we're going to use standing mics. So if you would like to come and ask a question, you can come down to a mic. Thanks.
Standing mics are very intimidating. Yeah. But Nicole is a very powerful person.
Will and Jan and others, thank you for this talk and for this research. Really important, really exciting. I have a question about the Eat Lancet diet that you all operationalized in your work, particularly because you said the nutrient adequate diets were so much less expensive. So in the Eat Lancet diet, since I've been engaging with it in my work as well, there's sort of baseline gram estimates, and then they also provide ranges for a bunch of the foods, particularly for the animal source foods. So the lower bound of the ranges in a lot of those categories is 0. Is it not? I can use that.
All right, thank you. Okay, check. There we go.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's much better. So the lower bound for a lot of those animal source foods is actually 0, which I'm wondering if you use the lower bound or the ranges, if some of the nutrient adequate diets would actually fit into the range that Eat Lancet has put out, not those point estimates. Just
that's
question.
a great observation. So we do use, actually, we ended up having to use the midpoints of the Eat Lancet. Let me pull that up here. So as Nicole said before the mic got connected, these slices for each food group, they actually specify a range for them. The problem is that as they specified those ranges, they specified they're mutually inconsistent, and so there's no way to operationalize the ranges. In other words, there's no way to specify what the total sum of some subgroup is. As a result of which, because there's no way to operationalize it, it's like they set a range, but it's not really a meaningful thing. On the other hand, they did specify specific midpoints for each of them, and so that's what this analysis represents. And it's a real good cautionary tale to people who are thinking about dietary guidelines, that if what you are writing down is not readable by a computer, in other words, we can't operationalize it to calculate in an algorithmic sense to compute a cost of doing that, it's going to be hard for actual people to do that, right? So in other words, what they wrote down is actually not coherent. It all makes sort of sense individually together, but it doesn't cohere.
That was a lovely presentation. I feel very proud of the Friedman School on this because it's got this mix of social science and nutrition. I think it's very, very impressive. Some people, a lot of people's one moment take on the Eat Lancet Commission report is that it's unrealistic because the quantities of expensive foods like meat are too low to be realistic. That feels out of step with your results, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely how the Eat Lancet Commission diet has been received. So just last night, actually, I happened to talk with a friend who works at the Eat Foundation in Oslo, in Norway, and he said that they were actually not particularly concerned that the focus of the Eat Lancet debate was so squarely on this one question that Park just raised. So what Park raised was like front and center for the Eat Commission, which is that when you look at the global pattern in the previous thing, but especially in the US, the slice of our current diet, which is so far out of the health boundary that Walt Willett and the group of the Eat Lancet Commission came to set for this diet, that is seen by many or is potentially unrealistic. I don't really know what to make of that question. We have seen in history quite substantial shifts in the mix of foods that populations have consumed. Those shifts have usually occurred under very dramatic circumstances like wartime and so forth. They often bounce back to a preferred diet as soon as the constraints are removed. Whether a society could have a 6-fold reduction in the amount of red meat that their culinary practices, their habits, their tastes have accustomed people to, is that a realistic thing? Well, people during wars have done it. It's certainly possible to do. People cut back on red meat even during a recession, right? So small cutbacks are certainly possible. The question of whether you can orchestrate it when people can afford to do it, is another matter. None of this seminar has been about food choice and about the set of things that people do when they can afford to do them. So it's a great question.
Following both those questions, what are the nutrients or the foods that are driving the difference between the Eat Lancet diet and the nutrient adequacy diet?
That's a great question. Let me see if I can pull it up from here. So if you look at this, this is the total cost of the Eat Lancet diet by food group. I don't have for you a comparable one for the nutrient adequate diet, but it would have just a tiny sliver of dairy, meat, fish, and eggs. That would be sharply collapsed. And then there would be appreciably more of the starchy staples. And then I think actually more of the pulses and nuts. Is that right? Jan might remember. And then there's no sweeteners at all. I'm pretty sure that there's no country in which sweeteners come into the nutrient adequate diet. There may be some of the refined oils, vegetable oils, in the least cost diet because they're very, very low cost sources of fat. And other foods are quite expensive for fat unless you include the animal source foods. Does that make?
Raises the question about judgment.
In the nutrient adequate diet. So the judgment calls that are in play for the nutrient adequate diet are, as far as we can tell from the nutrition evidence, first of all, regarding bioavailability and absorption. So we've been experimenting, or I should say Jan has been experimenting with trying to represent in these models, these cost models, the full range of evidence from the literature about bioavailability. So what happens if you, after running these models, end up with a diet that's so heavily vegetal with a lot of pulses and nuts that nutrition scientists are thinking that bioavailability is actually really low. So then you need to ramp up the micronutrient density in order to overcome the fact that bioavailability is so low. And that does affect the prices, the total cost of the diet somewhat, but not hugely. It doesn't change the tenor of the story. It doesn't change the basic fact that on the order of 1 billion people have anything like these diets unaffordable to them.
I'm having trouble. Thank you. This was just. I said to Jenny, I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. There's just so much interesting stuff in this presentation, but I'm having trouble wrapping my brain around the Eat Lancet. The difference between the nutrient one and the Eat Lancet one is that the nutrient one is only looking at nutrition, and the Lancet one is looking at nutrition plus environment. Is that right? More or less.
Well,
loosely.
The Eat Lancet one is looking at nutrition beyond nutrients. So that's phytochemicals, it's assumptions about bioavailability, this ineffable thing called protein quality that we're not quite sure what it is.
Yeah.
It doesn't have much to say about lipid quality, interestingly enough.
The omega-3.
And it has stuff to say about whole grains, but that's not the cost difference because whole grains are actually lower cost in many low-income countries. What it's really about is that they didn't feel they could squeeze so this gets back to Nicole's question. So they didn't feel they could squeeze the midpoint estimate of the meat down any lower than they could.
Okay.
Particularly for the category of red meat. So they include red meat in there and don't reduce it down to the bare minimum that would be needed for nutrients.
Nutritional. Yeah.
Of course, this is making these assumptions about bioavailability and about disease state. Clearly for an anemic person, a person who had bioavailability concerns from a disease state and so forth, you would need different diets. But it's fundamentally about the red, the blue being much larger than what are actually needed for just the essential nutrients.
Okay, because I was just having trouble wrapping my brain around that the one that putatively is putting more emphasis on the environment is higher in meat, fish, eggs, dairy.
Yes.
Yeah. But now you've explained it. Thank you.
I initially had a similar question to what was asked, so I'll just ask a different question based on this graph. I'm wondering why, for the upper middle and lower middle income countries, the cost of the Eat Lancet diet is actually higher than in both the high and low income.
Yeah, great observation. So as I had pointed out earlier, on the lower income side, it's because in the lower income countries, there are a set of foods in a number of these food groups which are just of lower quality than the ones that are available in the middle income countries. So for example, there would be a cassava product that is not available at all in a middle income country. Or there would be, what would be some examples? Stew meat. So the red meat category in low income countries is like a bone-in stew meat, which is just not available. Like you could barely go to, I mean, it's just a very low quality meat. But it does meet the definition of red meat for this. On the high income countries, it's because prices are lower. So food systems that have developed the end-to-end transportation in reefers, right, in refrigerated containers, so that as soon as they leave the farm, they're on a ro-ro, right? They're roll on, roll off, on a truck, on a train, to the loading dock behind a store, into a refrigerated, with end-to-end refrigeration. You're talking about a very, very low-cost system to get the fruits and vegetables, the eggs, the meat, fish, and so forth in the high-income countries. Even in middle-income countries, costs are higher. So this is after accounting for the differences in exchange rates, which is a big part of this project.
So just as an example, could you give an example of like what a upper middle income country would be?
So a typical upper middle income country would be Thailand. Typical lower middle income country would be like Ghana or I don't know. Senegal, lower middle income. And then low income would be like Senegal's neighbors would be low income.
So I'm taking Norbert's trade course, and so in your recommendations, I didn't hear anything about like how trade has anything to do with, or if it could you provide maybe an explanation on how increased or decreased, say, trade barriers or anything could help mitigate or improve conditions for people wanting to reach an adequate diet at an economic level?
Yeah, that's a great question. You are, students graduating now are entering a professional time in your careers when, for the first time in 20 or more years, there is an active likelihood of waves of nationalism, raising trade barriers, saying we're going to grow things ourselves, we're going to try to feed ourselves. And without doubt, centuries of experience and decades of economics research on the cost of food say that will raise food prices and make them more unstable, for the very simple reason that costs of production differ a lot by place. And there are also a lot of scale economies at various points in the system, where if you don't take advantage of the low-cost production opportunities where they are, and you don't take advantage of the scale economies where they happen to be, then you're going to pay more. And furthermore, any given location has a lot more variation in its climate than the world as a whole. So if there's a drought in Australia, maybe there won't be in the Ukraine. And so wheat, if you're open to trade in wheat from both Australia and the Ukraine, you're a lot better off than if you're only sourcing from one hemisphere or one region. And so over time, spatial integration, meaning a better transport system with more open borders that allows that movement of foods, has been absolutely central to lowering costs, stabilizing costs so that local shocks don't hit you so hard, and also doing that across all the different food groups for the overall diet. So, that's one question on which economists agree. So there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of debate about what you should do within countries, but there's not a lot of debate about what should happen at the border, which is at the border, the policeman should say, move along, move along. And then inside the country, they should say, watch out for food safety, watch out for food composition, watch out for marketing programs and deceptive advertising. But you don't want boundaries at the border because they just serve to protect incumbent interests who will lobby for protection, as we're seeing today in our fruit and vegetable sector in the United States, where fruit and vegetable growers in Florida, California are absolutely delighted to see the end of NAFTA. Florida is heavily advocating for the end of NAFTA so they can raise fruit and vegetable prices, especially in the winter.
Hey, Will. Looking at your last slide, I wondered, to what extent should we conclude that we need to make nutrient-rich foods cheaper versus, or maybe in addition to, combating poverty more generally around the world?
Well, I hope it's not either or. And in fact, it's often both and, quite emphatically, because these are very high employment sectors. So that if a government should be interested in providing the public goods, the infrastructure for you wanted the final slide here, provide the food system changes that would lower, a lot of those jobs are very much open to lower skilled, lower income workers who can't get jobs in other sectors. So I think it's definitely a both and. Employment in the food system helps to lower food prices and helps to make the foods more affordable for others.
Hi there. Related to that question, I was wondering if your research probed into the reason that foods are priced as they are in low-income versus high-income countries versus middle-income countries, and how that reflects on how farm labor might be paid at a living wage or below a living wage, and maybe that's why food is so much lower in high-income countries, if your research looked at that at all.
That's a great question, yes. So wages for farm workers, but also food system workers off the farm, and working conditions, including risk of injury, pesticide exposure, lots of things, is crucial social justice issue. It doesn't turn out to be that important for the price, however, because labor costs are not a very large fraction of the end retail, labor costs in production. Retail costs are much more important for higher income countries. We're just beginning this research agenda, though, about the whole farm to market chain across these different categories of food. So very big open question, really good question.
Again, thank you, Will, for this great presentation. Thank you all for great questions. And wish you all a great afternoon.